just a bit of a recap. Last week we were looking at really the between the Old and the New Testament. Really, there's a massive gap between the culture of the Old Testament, the culture of the New Testament, and we were just beginning to look at what caused that culture to be changed so much. We were looking at the end of the Old Testament with the Persian kingdom, not the Assyrian kingdom, and they really were ruling in a sense and sending the people back to Israel. And then obviously we looked at Alexander the Great and his kingdom. So instead of being ruled from the east and with Eastern culture, suddenly Western culture, Greek thinking becomes the thing, and the Greek Empire goes across all the way to India and has influence in all of those areas, the culture and the language and all of those things. And in a sense that sets the scene for where we are going to continue tonight. We looked at how the Greek, after Alexander the Great died, the Greek kingdom broke down into four, and the key part being this bit here, which is Israel, that was swapping sides between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids, all Greek kingdoms, but swapping sides. So that's just a quick recap, if you weren't here, or to remind you. And we got to sort of the end of the history narrative last week, saying this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, shows up. He's a ruler in the Seleucid kingdom, and he is upset by what the Romans do, and he comes back and starts to bring like a reign of destruction in Jerusalem. And we sort of left the narrative there. I talked a little bit at the end about Greek culture and how it had such a big influence on the Jewish people. We'll return to that again later tonight. So Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He sacrificed a pig on the altar there, and it really caused a massive, in fact there's a little bit more detail here about how that all happened. He came into the temple and he actually tried to get one of the Jewish priests to sacrifice a pig to Zeus on the altar. That priest was called Matthias ben Yohanan. Later he is known as Matthias Maccabee, and he refuses to sacrifice to the Greek gods. So another Jewish priest steps up to do it instead, and Matthias kills him there at the altar, and that is the start of the rebellion. Matthias escapes to the countryside with his 5 sons, and he calls on anyone who's got zeal for the law, for the Torah, to rise up against Antiochus, against the Seleucid rulers who were there. So he escapes to the wilderness, his sons with him. And this is the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabee kingdom. Maccabee means hammer. If you were to go to Israel today, you'd hear that word often. And if you are a football fan, you'll have heard of Haifa Maccabi or Maccabi Tel Aviv, 2 of their football teams. And occasionally they play against some of our sides in European football, and all of those places. Still celebrated massively amongst the Jews today. They consider the Maccabees to be heroes for the Jewish nation even now. And that began 25 years of guerrilla war. Guerrilla war is the come in, do some destruction, go and hide again. And it's the sort of almost the typical way of you come in and do some stuff and then go, disappear. And this is what they were doing for 25 years. In 166, so only a year later, Matthias died, and his son Judah Maccabee, also known as Hammer, succeeded him and then began leading the revolt against the Seleucid Empire. They began by attacking the Hellenist Jews, so any Jews that were compromising with the Greek people, they began to attack them. They were destroying pagan altars and Greek altars. They were circumcising the local boys because Antiochus Epiphanes had said to be circumcised means the death penalty. So if they circumcised the boys, it meant the boys had to be with them to be safe. So therefore, they were gaining themselves an army by doing that. And their tactics were successful. And soon they had established control in Jerusalem. I've got a picture of Judah. There we go. And they had established control in Jerusalem and some of the parts in the south of what we know as Judah, really. The Maccabees cleansed the temple. Obviously, in the meantime, it had been, desecrated and had not sacrifices had not been taking place, and they started sacrifices again. And Jonathan Maccabee, another one of the 5 brothers, becomes high priest. So there's Judah, there's Jonathan on the left there, and another brother, Simon, on the right. And so, as a result of this, the Seleucids said, that's enough, sent a big army to retake Jerusalem. But while they were still traveling, Lysias, who was the empire, the king of the Seleucids at that time, died. And so the army was quickly withdrawn to try and sort out, who's going to be succeeding Lysias. So in that sense, this trying to retake Jerusalem never happened because of what happened somewhere else. The army's withdrawn, and they're saved in that way. And at this time, the Seleucid Empire is starting to break down. This huge empire, in a sense, these big empires are impossible to keep with the roads, and with you can't get to the edges of the empire easily. So that the empire's starting to break down. The edges are starting to be ragged, and so for these guys here, right at the southern edge, they're on the they are in a sense one of the lower priorities. They're able to get a good foothold in Israel, and what began to happen within the Maccabees is there were some who were happy to have Jerusalem as their place of worship, and worship is re-established. But there were others who wanted to see the kingdom re-established. David's kingdom, this huge swathe of land which David controlled. At the minute, they just had Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Some wanted the whole back. Some were happy that Jewish worship is restarted, and they're almost happy to say, we've got Jerusalem, let's stop there. So there was almost the beginning of a division within the Maccabee empire right at the very beginning of it. So for a period, this Maccabee uprising had great success, and they grew and expanded even further. But as I've said, not all were content to follow that policy. They took, let me see if I've got a map somewhere. Here we go. They took control of this area here, which is Idumea, and this is what is now it's Jordan, and that's where, if you've been to Petra, that's where that is, and all of those things, or seen pictures. Then it was the Edomites, or the Idumeans. These are descendants of Esau, and there's Jacob and Esau. They're an Arabic nation, but they took control there, and there was a policy of really forcing those people to become Jewish, which we will see there's a very interesting result of that later on. So this group of people here who are not Jews but are related sort of in the distant ancestry, they're forcing them to become Jews, or at least strongly encouraging them to become Jews. And so that is going on here with this kingdom of the Maccabees. If we just go back. So there we've got Jonathan and Simon, two of the brothers. I've just mentioned already that we see the seeds of division already just picking up here. Last week I spoke about how some wanted to take on the Greek culture. Some wanted to remain true to the Hebrew culture and thinking and all of those things. And that begins to become a little bit more well established. We see the Pharisees, or at least their predecessors, they're content to have re-established the religious worship in Jerusalem. All that they really want is to be able to worship God freely. They don't need to see this huge kingdom of David re-established. But then you've got some others, probably the forerunners of the Sadducees, who are more politically minded. They want to see a political kingdom re-established. They're not so interested in the religious aspect. They want to see the kingdom of Israel return. And so we see these two division, two sides emerging at this time, even in the early days of the Maccabee Empire. Judah Maccabee died in 160 BC, so you can see his dad was a year, he was only 6 or so years in charge, and then his brother Jonathan, who we've got a picture of there on screen, then takes and then he's succeeded by his brother. And in a sense, we see here Jonathan is both king and high priest, although they didn't call him king at this time. So for the next few years, the threat of the Seleucids in the north, the Greek Empire, was always there. Jonathan is driven back, but eventually makes a peace treaty with them in 153, enabling them to be an independent part of the Seleucid Empire. They were still under Seleucid controls. They paid taxes to the Seleucids, but they were able to rule themselves. So we see the Seleucid Empire is breaking down, but they've still got a level of control, but the Jews are able to rule themselves for the first time in quite a long time. And Judah remained in control of itself all the way through until the Romans came in 63 BC. Jonathan was made high priest again, and then he was murdered, and his brother Simon succeeded him in 143 BC. So another 10 years, another short reign there, and we've got Simon's picture on screen at the minute. Again, he was murdered. This is a pretty, it's a dangerous thing to be a ruler in Jerusalem at this time. He's not there very long, 10 years or so, and he is murdered. But Simon establishes what is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. His brothers before him, there are a few of them. But in a sense, this is where it's really established that this family is in control. And in 140 BC, he's voted, and I put in your notes there, Greek style, as king and as high priest. And in a sense, this is the first time you've seen those two things, a king in Israel since David. That caused some issues because the Pharisees particularly did not like it, because they thought that a king should come from the line of David, and of course this guy was not from the line of David. So there's some tension going on even there. And again, he was murdered, and he's succeeded by his son, who's called John Hyrcanus. There is a picture of John Hyrcanus. I'm sure that's not what he really looked like, but that's what he is pictured like on the internet. So, but he's got a very impressive hat, doesn't he? So, John Hyrcanus manages around about 30 years, which is long-lived, and he's very well known in Israel as a result. It's a long reign in comparison to some of the others. And as I've said already, the Seleucid kingdom is disintegrating at this time, and many states were able to assert their independence from the Seleucid kingdom, and one of those is Judea. They're able to begin to really be free of the Seleucid influence. John expands this Hasmonean kingdom, and he subjected, as I've already said, the Idumeans, the Edomites, and many chose to be circumcised and become Jews through that period, before and through that period when he is ruling in Israel. When he dies, his son Aristobulus the first becomes ruler. He only lasts for a year. Aristobulus' rule is not a good one. John wants his wife to succeed him as ruler, and his son Aristobulus to succeed him as priest. However, when he died, Aristobulus, his son, puts his wife, who's Aristobulus', just have to check this is right, is his mother, in prison where she starves to death. He also put 3 of his brothers. I'm just pausing there because it may be not his mother. I've got a feeling John was married twice, John Hyrcanus, so it was his stepmother. I've got to get that right. So he puts his stepmother and his 3 stepbrothers in prison. His full brother, who it remains out of prison, Antigonus, and becomes his right-hand man for a period of time. His mother starved to death, his stepmother, I should say, starved to death whilst in prison, and then he is both high priest and king. However, he died after 1 year due to, the descriptions say he had severe abdominal pain. So, he had something. Just before he died, his wife, who is Salome, she cooks up a plot. She's afraid of his brother, Aristobulus, and she thinks that when he dies, Aristobulus is going to get rid of her. So she cooks up a plot to blame Aristobulus for rising up against... have I got the name? Antigonus, sorry. Let me start that again. Aristobulus is married to Salome, and Salome is afraid of his brother Antigonus. So she cooks up a plot that Antigonus is plotting against Aristobulus. So Aristobulus has him killed just before he dies. So on Aristobulus' death, Salome releases the 3 brothers, the 3 half-brothers from prison, and one of them, Alexander Janus, becomes the ruler. And very quickly, Salome marries Alexander Janus. There are some who would say that there's a plot afoot here. Others would say Janus is just following the Levitical law. Jesus says, when they're talking about Jesus, they ask him about what if a brother dies, the next brother should marry, and the next brother. Well, that's how it was. Salome had no children, and so it was, in a sense, Alexander Janus's duty to marry Salome in Hebrew law. It was also politically astute for him to do that. So who knows? But that's what happened. Salome, Janus becomes ruler. Salome is married to him. Oh, I've got some pictures somewhere. I should. There's Aristobulus, and there's Alexander Janus, and there we go. There's a picture of Salome Alexandra. Again, who knows what they really look like, but these are traditional pictures of them. So Alexander marries Salome's his brother's widow, according to Levitical law. And then there's this interesting thing. I was thinking, I've got something wrong here, and then I realized I put the page of notes the wrong way around in my notes. So Alexander is from a Sadducee family, or at least a Greek-thinking, Hellenistic family, and they're adopting Greek culture. Salome is from a Pharisee family. In fact, it's believed that her father was the leader of the Pharisees. And Alexander is known as a war leader. In fact, almost all of his reign, he's at war. He's expanding the kingdom. He's one of those that wants to see political rule for the Jewish people expanded and grown, wants to see the kingdom of David re-established. And so he's expanding the kingdom, but also there comes a time when there's a civil war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or at least what was the forerunner of those in that time. So first of all, Alexander grows the kingdom. Then he where's that map? There we go. There's sort of the Hasmonean kingdom. You can see the various stages of growth there. Sort of the early stuff, the pink bit, and then as it gets bigger and bigger, as it gets darker in color, that's the later, as the kingdom grew and pretty much reestablishes almost what was the kingdom of David there. Not just Israel, but the states on the eastern side of the Jordan and to the north and to the south, taking control of all of those places. So really successful in a sense in terms of growing this kingdom, this Hasmonean dynasty. But there's this war between the traditionalists, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Alexander seems to have deliberately provoked the Pharisees to a fight. One day they're in the temple. He's supposed to be making one of the sacrifices that involves pouring some water on the altar. Instead, he pours it on his feet. And that response of the Pharisees is obviously anger. And, this is treating the temple and the sacrificial system with disrespect. So there comes this war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Ultimately, Alexander Janus wins that war. He killed many thousands of Jews, and at the end of it, he crucified 800 of the Pharisees in Jerusalem. So, he's really taking massive retribution on the Pharisees at this time. At the same time, his wife is a Pharisee sympathizer. And it's said that she hid 300 Pharisees and fed them and all this stuff. And her dad, we understand, was one of the leaders of the Pharisees. So even though he's doing this stuff, she is secretly, it appears, because they remained on good terms right till the end, she's secretly protecting the Pharisees from her own husband. He died from a combination of alcoholism and malaria, and Salome, his wife, succeeds him as the ruler of the Jewish nation. There are 4 women who ruled throughout history that we know in Jewish nation. She is one of them. So Alexander's wife, Salome, known as Salome Alexander, rules as as queen, and her son is the high priest, Hyrcanus II. And so Salome has been protecting the Pharisees during her husband's reign, and it's said that her brother, not her father, sorry, is the leader of the Pharisee sect. Hyrcanus II is due to succeed her, but it's a very short time before he is challenged by his brother. You thought that British monarchy was bad and it was dangerous. Well, here it is happening somewhere else in Israel. Here's the two brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. Not only do they have complicated names, but they use them again, just to test me. So again, there's a civil war between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, these two brothers who both claim the throne, and from 67 to 63 BC, there's this tussle going on between the two brothers. After a few months, right at the beginning of Hyrcanus' rule, Aristobulus wins, basically revolts against his brother, and fairly soon, 3 or 4 months, takes control. Aristobulus defeats Hyrcanus in battle. Eventually, they make a peace treaty, but that's only short-lived. Hyrcanus gives up his right to the throne and gives up his right to priesthood, but then immediately goes off to get support from the neighboring nation, the Nabateans, and comes back to try and overthrow his brother. This is when we see a really interesting development, because the Hasmonean kingdom up until this point has been they've been sort of allied with the Roman Empire, and because these two brothers can't stop fighting with each other, they basically say to the Romans, will you come and sort this out? Come and put one of us in charge. And so they come, and what happens? They kick both of them out and take control themselves. So we suddenly see the end of the Hasmonean dynasty because the Romans come. And obviously the Roman Empire is enormous. There we go. There is sort of the extent of the Roman Empire that we know. At certain times it was bigger, at certain times it was smaller. You can see, well, certainly Kent is in it. Doesn't go to the whole of the UK, does it? But we were part of that here in Kent. So that is, the Roman Empire we know pretty well. So the end of the end of the Hasmonean kingdom comes because they ask the Roman general Pompey to come and sort it out. And the Roman general Pompey comes, and this is a really interesting time in the Roman Empire anyway. And so he is on his own rise to power, trying to rise and take power, get his more territories for himself. And so he takes Jerusalem for himself and inaugurates Roman control over Palestine. And Pompey appoints Antipater. You remember I spoke to you about the Idumeans. He appoints Antipater as his sort of ruler. Antipater is an Idumean, but he is a converted to Jewish Idumean. And interestingly enough, you will have heard of his son, Herod the Great. So we get to something this is not too long before Jesus. So Antipater is appointed as ruler and installs Hyrcanus as high priest and allows worship to continue in Jerusalem. Now, Antipater has been converted to Judaism, so he wants to see Judaism succeed. We'll see this as a feature of the Herod dynasty, which sort of follows. However, the dynasty is quite short-lived and a bit fractured. We'll see in a moment or two. So that all takes place in in 63, and Antipater is installed and all of those things. In around about the 40 years before Jesus, there's real turmoil in the Roman Empire. Those of you that know your history will know that there's this sort of the change between a republic, the Roman Republic changes into the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic, where leaders are appointed by the voting, although it's the voting of the elite, and the Senate rules, to suddenly the empire is ruled by the strongest general. And all of that history you can go and read about. Julius Caesar is it Julius Caesar? He's killed famously the Ides of March and all that stuff in 44 BC. And then we see in 40 there's a rebellion in Israel. So you can see it's all going on at a similar time. You find the stories of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. All of this stuff is going on around this period of time. And so there's a very brief uprising again. The son of, the nephew of Hyrcanus, Antigonus II, Matthias, what's a name and a half, isn't it? Made an alliance with a Parthian army and won back Jerusalem. And Antigonus won popular support amongst the Jewish people because he's trying to re-establish the Hasmonean dynasty. And then we see this guy, Herod the Great. He's the son of Antipater, and he is a supporter of Hyrcanus, and he's made the tetrarch of Galilee. So he's the local Roman ruler in Galilee, appointed by the Romans, and he's got all sorts of relationships with the Roman generals. He's grown up with them and all sorts of things. But in 40, when this rebellion occurs, he quickly escapes to Rome and returns later, basically with an army to re-establish control in Israel. So quickly, the Romans defeated the Parthian army, 38 BC. So we're looking at 2 years where there was this sort of rebellion again, and the Roman control is re-established in Palestine. By the end of 38, he's won back everything except for Jerusalem, and in the spring of 37 BC, he lays siege to Jerusalem, and the walls are breached, and Antigonus locked himself in the fortress next to the temple. The defenders are holding the temple and its surrounding area. So through this time, the siege is going on, but Herod is allowing animals to be taken into the temple for sacrifice, because he himself, though an Idumean, is also a converted Jew. So even though he's laying siege to Jerusalem and to the temple area and all of those things, at the same time he's still allowing animals to go in for sacrifices to be made. Eventually the temple falls, and Herod struggled to restrain the Roman soldiers. So the Romans wanted to basically destroy the temple, desecrate the temple, and Herod is really working hard to stop that happening. And in a sense, as a result, he gains some credibility with the Jewish people. He's allowed them to continue to sacrifice. He's allowed them to, he's tried to protect the temple from the Roman soldiers. And so when all of this is over and he is installed as ruler, they are sort of sympathetic to him, because they understand that he wants to worship God as well as they do. Mark Antony, the Roman general who's backing Herod, kills Antigonus and removes any threat of his return. Then Herod does something which we see repeated 30 years later in his reign. He kills anyone who's a threat to him. So he kills the rest of the Hasmonean family anyone who might have any sort of claim to the Hasmonean throne, Herod gets rid of him. And we see him repeat the same thing 30 odd years later at the birth of Jesus. Anyone who might be a threat to him, he kills all the babies in Bethlehem, which is described as a massacre, but probably there were 5 or 6 babies of that age in Bethlehem at that time, which is bad enough, but it's not the hundreds which some people describe. Bethlehem was a small town, and there were few babies of that age at that time. But that is what he's known. Anyone that's a threat to him, he's getting rid of them pretty quickly. So we see here the birth, in a sense, of the Jewish sects. We see the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees begin. We see, one of the Sadducee rulers murdering 800 Pharisees, crucifying 800 Pharisees. So when you read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the New Testament, there's a lot of history. And not very long before, it may be, well, certainly less than 100 years before, this sort of stuff has been going on. So the Pharisees are Orthodox Jews. They're happy, in a sense, with a small kingdom as long as they can worship God. For them, the religious part of life is the most important. And the high priest was the most important role. The Sadducees, as we've heard, much more influenced by the Greek. They want to expand the kingdom. They're happy to make treaties with the nations around them. They've instituted voting for appointments and positions, and for them, political power is the most important thing. And you can see in the New Testament, when Jesus is challenged by one or the other of them, you can see those opinions coming forward. Just obviously, I've given you loads of information without any sources right now, and unfortunately, there's not time for me to go into all of those things. But the major sources we have for this is what we would call, as Protestants, the Apocrypha. The Catholic Church and some of the Orthodox churches have a bunch of books in the middle of the Bible which we don't use. 1 and 2 Maccabees, there's a whole bunch of history there. It's definitely worth reading for the historical value of it. Obviously, as it's not recognized as part of the canon of Scripture, as this is not the Word of God, but certainly for historical value, it gives us a really good picture. And the other major source is Flavius Josephus. I talked about him last week. He's a historian writing at the time the temple is destroyed in AD 70, so maybe 100 or so, 150 years after these events. He's writing a history for the Romans, and he writes all about these events as well. So there are 2 major sources. There are obviously other sources as well. For some reason, when I was a student at the IBTI, on my study periods, I would go and sit in the library and read Josephus' history. That was when I really was too tired to do any writing. I would just read history, and for some reason, I love it. And I don't know why, but there we go. Obviously, we have in this period of time, we see, well, recently, I think in the 50s or 60s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And we have the Essenes. We'll look at the Essenes next week. This really, really strange religious sect. They are out in the desert copying Scripture and putting it in pots and hiding it in the ground, and probably to keep it safe from the Greeks, from those trying to destroy it. And we know that they were writing at that period because some of the coins and other things found with the Dead Sea Scrolls are Hasmonean coins, Hasmonean artifacts. So all of that is some of the sources for this. Obviously, if you want more sources, I can give that to you, but this is just a really brief overview. Okay, it is time for us to have a break. Grab a cup of tea, go to the loo if you need to, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes' time.